The train sliced through the darkness like a steel serpent, its wheels screaming against the tracks as the storm raged outside. Inside the opulent Grand Salon, a hush had fallen, a silence so unnatural it felt like the train itself was holding its breath. A man was dead, not by accident, not by fate, but by a poisoned cup meant for someone else. And now, as the rain hammered against the windows and shadows flickered in the dim chandeliers, one truth became terrifyingly clear: the killer was still among them, watching, waiting, and perhaps ready to strike again. The relentless downpour lashed against the steel roof of the Midnight Magnolia Express, a masterpiece of polished mahogany and brass, slicing through the storm-racked darkness with an almost eerie grace. The night was thick with mist, swirling around the platform like spectral fingers, and the storm raged overhead, lightning flickering across the vast expanse of sky, turning the train station into a brief, ghostly tableau. The passengers, wealthy elites wrapped in furs and silk, their laughter crisp yet hollow, rushed aboard, shielding themselves from the icy rain with umbrellas that glistened under the station's dim glow. But even amid the gleaming sophistication, there was a peculiar stillness, an unspoken tension that lingered like an unfinished sentence. Inside, the grand dining car exuded an intoxicating warmth, the golden chandeliers casting their glow over the richly adorned travelers, the clink of crystal, the murmur of voices, the soft, calculated laughter, all of it played like the overture to a performance yet to unfold. The train, its heart beating in rhythmic pulses upon the steel tracks, had begun its journey into the unknown. Seated at a modest corner table, nearly blending into the velvet shadows, was Detective Agatha Marple. Her graying hair was neatly pinned in a practical style, her wire-rimmed glasses perched on her nose as she appeared engrossed in the small leather notebook resting in her lap. But those who truly observed would notice she was watching, not writing. Her sharp eyes moved deliberately from one guest to another, cataloguing their every glance, every hesitation, every gesture that betrayed more than their words ever could. Her attention was first drawn to Evelyn Harcourt, a striking woman in sapphire silk, her beauty emphasized by the flickering chandelier light. To the untrained eye, she was the epitome of elegance, but Agatha saw the slight tremor in her fingers, the way her smile faltered at the edges. Across from her sat Lucas Barrington, a man whose casual confidence was almost too carefully constructed. His relaxed posture, his deliberate smirk, it was a mask, and masks were meant to hide something. Further along, near the bar, Theodore Grayson stood with rigid intensity, his fingers clutching a glass that had remained untouched for far too long. His gaze was locked onto Evelyn, but there was no longing in his eyes, only something dark, something dangerously unreadable. A single blinding flash of lightning illuminated the car, stark and unforgiving. For the briefest of moments, every expression, every tension-ridden glance was laid bare in the white-hot glare. And then the train plunged back into golden-lit normalcy, but the air had shifted. Agatha could feel it. Then, without warning, the world lurched violently. A horrendous shudder rattled through the Magnolia Express. Glasses shattered, silverware clattered against the mahogany tables, and startled cries tore through the once merry chatter. The chandeliers above swayed precariously, their golden glow casting chaotic shadows on the walls. Evelyn gasped, clutching Lucas's arm. Theodore's grip tightened around the bar's edge, his knuckles white. The conductor burst into the car, his face pale, his breath ragged. "Everyone remain calm," he called, though his own voice wavered with uncertainty. But Agatha Marple was already on the move. Her instincts had sharpened through years of unseen battles against deception, and now, they urged her forward, down the dimly lit corridor where an ominous stillness loomed. As she entered the dining car, a chill settled over the room, different from the cold storm outside. This was the chill of death. The scene unfolded like a twisted painting. Fine china lay shattered upon the velvet carpet. A deep crimson stain had begun to seep outward from an overturned wine bottle. dark and ominous, but it wasn't the wine that had stolen the breath from the room. At the farthest table, his head slumped forward, Randolph Hensley, the train's esteemed financier, sat motionless. His cap lay discarded beside him, his expression frozen in a silent gasp. The coppery scent of blood tainted the air. The conductor staggered back, his voice barely above a whisper. He's dead. But Agatha Marple did not flinch. She merely adjusted her spectacles, her keen gaze sweeping over the room like a detective, piecing together the fragments of a broken mirror. The Midnight Magnolia Express had left the station with its secrets. It would not reach its destination until every last one had been unearthed. The air inside the Midnight Magnolia Express had thickened, laden with an unease that had settled over the passengers like an unwelcome fog. The train's rhythmic clatter against the steel tracks had once been soothing, but now it felt ominous, like the ticking of a countdown leading to an unknown disaster. The storm outside raged with unchecked fury, lightning streaking across the sky in jagged bursts, momentarily illuminating the train's polished brass fittings and opulent decor. The dining car, once alive with polite laughter and the soft clink of silverware against china, had transformed into a stage where unspoken tensions played out in furtive glances and hushed murmurs. At the heart of it all, Detective Agatha Marple remained composed, her sharp gaze dissecting the scene before her. Seated discreetly at a corner table, her modest attire and unassuming demeanor made her easy to overlook, a mistake most would regret. Her fingers traced over the pages of her notebook, where careful observations had been recorded in precise, deliberate strokes. Across the room, Evelyn Harcourt clung to Lucas Barrington's arm, her expression a mixture of fear and something else, something harder to name. Theodore Grayson stood at the edge of the room, his gaze locked on Evelyn and Lucas, his jaw tight, his fingers curled around the rim of his untouched glass. The weight of unspoken accusations seemed to press against the walls, and Agatha knew that beneath the facade of civility, something dangerous simmered. A sudden gasp rippled through the room as the conductor, his usually composed expression marred by unease, approached her. He hesitated for the briefest moment, then leaned in. "Miss Marple, we need your help." His voice was low, almost swallowed by the storm outside. The detective's gaze flickered toward the doorway, where the shadowed figures of other passengers loomed, whispering among themselves. Fear was contagious, and she could see it spreading like ink through water. She rose gracefully, her presence a quiet force against the brewing chaos. "Keep everyone together. Panic serves no one." Her voice, though soft, carried the weight of authority. The conductor nodded, grateful for her composure, and turned to reassure the uneasy crowd. Stepping past them, Agatha entered the dimly lit corridor, the distant rumble of thunder masking her footsteps. The train swayed beneath her, its relentless momentum mirroring the accelerating tension within its walls. She reached the observation car, where the atmosphere was thick with something unspoken. Near the window, the silhouette of Margaret Wells stood stark against the storm's relentless blur. She turned slightly at Agatha's approach, her features sharp, her expression unreadable. "Miss Marple," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "What brings you here?" Agatha settled into the seat across from her, pretending to jot something down in her notebook. "Oh, simply the view," she murmured. But her gaze never left Margaret's. Because in this game of shadows and deception, every glance, every hesitation told a story waiting to be unraveled. The Midnight Magnolia Express had begun its journey with secrets buried deep. But Agatha Marple knew one truth above all: secrets never stay hidden for long. The Horizon Express roared through the night, its sleek carriages slicing through the storm like a dagger through silk. Rain lashed against the windows, each droplet illuminated by intermittent flashes of lightning, and within the train's lavish compartments, tension crackled like static in the air. The dining car, once alive with the quiet hum of refined conversation and the delicate chime of crystal glassware, had fallen into a subdued hush. Detective Agatha Moreau, her demeanor ever composed, sat near the window, her gloved fingers tracing an idle pattern against the smooth cover of her notebook. Across from her, Genevieve Lancaster, a woman with an air of brittle elegance, sipped her tea with measured grace, though her knuckles betrayed the pressure with which she gripped the porcelain cup. "You find these journeys so inspiring, Miss Moreau?" Genevieve's tone held a practiced indifference, but the faint edge in her voice did not go unnoticed. Agatha offered a small knowing smile. One never knows what stories a train might hold. Genevieve exhaled sharply, a sound that was more scoff than sigh. "Oh, you'll find plenty of stories here, I suppose. Especially if you're interested in theft." She set her cup down with a sharp clink, her eyes dark with accusation. Agatha raised an eyebrow. "Theft, Mrs. Lancaster?" "Yes." Genevieve's voice was clipped, her frustration barely concealed. "That scoundrel, Alexander Harrington. He's no more than a common thief masquerading as a gentleman. That artifact he so boldly boasts about, that exquisite relic from Cairo, it's mine. Stolen from under me like a prize lifted by some street swindler." Her fingers tightened around her saucer as though she might shatter it. "I spent months in negotiations, and then he waltzes in, pockets lined with arrogance and money, and suddenly it's his." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "To him it's nothing more than a bauble, a trinket, but to me," her voice faltered, and for the first time Agatha caught something else beneath the indignation. Something deeper. "That must be frustrating," Agatha murmured, her tone sympathetic, but her mind already racing. Genevieve's mouth tightened, and she turned toward the rain-spattered window, her fingers drumming an impatient rhythm against the porcelain. Agatha observed her a moment longer before rising, making a final note in her book. "Thank you for the insight, Mrs. Lancaster," she said smoothly. "I find your perspective most enlightening." She left the observation car, her thoughts as sharp as the chill in the air. Intrigue had begun to coil around the passengers like a slow tightening noose, and she intended to see just who would be caught in its grasp. Later that afternoon, as Agatha passed through the narrow hallway leading toward the baggage car, hushed voices stopped her in her tracks. She moved soundlessly, pressing herself against the wooden paneling, her pulse steady but alert. "I'm not asking for anything unusual," came a woman's voice, smooth, silken, but edged with something unmistakably sharp. "Clara Vale," a male voice, hesitant, followed. I don't know what you mean, miss." "Oh, I think you do." Clara's tone dipped, turning honeyed. "Just tell me what's in the box. I saw Mr. Harrington give it to you when we boarded." "What's inside?" The porter hesitated. "It's just a piece of luggage, Miss Vale." A soft laugh, delicate as lace, but carrying the weight of something far more dangerous. "You're a clever man, aren't you? Just a little peek. No one will know." A pause. The sound of shuffling. Agatha's pencil hovered, poised above her notebook. The porter murmured something too quiet to hear, and then Clara laughed again, a tinkling sound that might have been charming if one didn't know better. When the conversation ended and the pair departed in opposite directions, Agatha remained still for a long moment, her mind assembling the pieces of a puzzle still obscured by shadows. She returned to the salon, penning a careful note in her journal. "Clara Vale, more than just charm. Intentions unclear, keep watching." The Horizon Express thundered onward, its whistle slicing through the storm, a lonely cry in the vast, unrelenting countryside. Within its walls, the carefully cultivated elegance of luxury had begun to crack, revealing the treachery that lurked beneath. The dining car, once a haven of refinement, now bore the silent weight of secrets. In the daylight, under the cool scrutiny of morning, things looked different, more exposed. As Agatha moved down the length of the car, her fingers lightly tracing the carved wooden trim of the tables, her gaze flickered over the faces of the passengers. Guilt was not always loud, sometimes it sat in silence, watching, waiting. Near the center of the room, her eyes caught something, a porcelain shard resting by the foot of a chair, barely noticeable, unless one knew exactly where to look, and Agatha always knew where to look. The Horizon Express sliced through the endless dark, the storm's fury clawing at its windows as though desperate to break inside. Within the dimly lit dining car, a teacup lay overturned, its delicate handle curling toward Agatha Moreau like a beckoning finger, the rim trembling ever so slightly with the vibration of the rails. A thin shimmer of liquid pooled at its edge, catching the light in a way that would have been easily dismissed by anyone less inclined to notice. Agatha tilted her head, eyes narrowing. Unlike the chaos of shattered glass and crockery strewn from the previous evening's disturbances, this cup lay alone, untouched, separate. An anomaly, and anomalies demanded scrutiny. She retrieved a fresh handkerchief, its pristine white, a stark contrast to the dark wood of the table, and with the precision of a surgeon, she dabbed at the liquid. A faint iridescence clung to the cloth, something that would have gone unnoticed had she not been looking for it. Her pulse remained steady, but her thoughts quickened. Poison, a slow, deliberate method of execution, but for whom? You'd think someone would have tidied that up by now, came a voice behind her, light but laced with the casual indifference of someone who had seen too much to be surprised by anything. Agatha turned to face Mrs. Crowley, a woman of ample presence and insatiable curiosity, her large hat tilting precariously as she gestured vaguely at the cup. "The poor driver," she sighed, lowering her voice as though sharing a secret, "only came in here to sit for a moment. Didn't even order anything. Just picked up a cup from the sideboard." Agatha's gaze sharpened. "Did he? Yes." Mrs. Crowley leaned in, eyes twinkling with the thrill of sharing something scandalous. Poor man was exhausted. Who could blame him for helping himself? "But you," she squinted at Agatha, as if only now realizing how intently she was being observed. "You look serious. You don't think?" Agatha lifted a gloved hand ever so slightly, halting the thought before it could fully form. "No conclusions yet, Mrs. Crowley, just observations." She folded the handkerchief with calm precision, tucking it away before returning her gaze to the older woman. "You said he didn't order anything. You saw him take the cup himself." "Indeed," Mrs. Crowley nodded enthusiastically. "Came in from the other end of the car, walked straight over, picked it up, and sat down, hardly took a sip before." She stopped, a shadow flickering across her expression, the reality of what she was saying settling in. "Before what?" Agatha prompted, though she already knew the answer. Mrs. Crowley swallowed. "Before he collapsed." Agatha absorbed this quietly, offering only a slight nod, as though Mrs. Crowley had confirmed more than the weather forecast. "Thank you," she said smoothly. "You've been most helpful." As Mrs. Crowley drifted away, her large hat bobbing with each step, Agatha turned back to the silent crime scene. The pieces of the puzzle spread before her like a railway map, lines converging, branching, leading somewhere inevitable. The driver had not ordered that drink, he had simply picked it up, which meant that cup had not been meant for him. A mistake, or perhaps a warning. Her fingers tapped against her notebook as she considered the implications. The intended recipient was still aboard the train, someone who had unknowingly dodged death, and someone else had just learned that their attempt had failed. That person would try again. With a final glance around the dining car, Agatha shut her notebook and left the room. The Horizon Express thundered forward, its whistle cutting through the storm. The world outside remained an endless stretch of shadows and rain, but inside the game had already begun anew. Agatha Moreau hesitated for only a moment outside cabin 3, her sharp gaze flicking over the polished brass number plate before she adjusted her spectacles and rapped lightly on the door. The silence stretched just long enough to suggest hesitation before a brusque voice cut through it, hoarse, impatient. "Yes, who's there?" "Miss Moreau," she answered evenly. "Might I have a word, Mr. Harrington?" There was another pause, the faint rustling of movement. The door cracked open just enough to reveal Gregory Harrington's angular face, his dark eyes gleaming with something that wasn't quite fear, but wasn't far from it either. Without a word, he pulled the door open further and stepped aside. "Forgive the intrusion," Agatha murmured, stepping into the dimly lit cabin. The space was more cluttered than expected, considering Gregory's reputation for precision. The scent of cigar smoke and something more acrid lingered in the air. On the seat by the window, a leather case lay open, its contents half spilled, papers in a haphazard tumble, a small velvet pouch barely concealing something heavy and irregularly shaped. Gregory gestured vaguely toward a chair. "Sit, if you must." His appearance was frayed at the edges, his usual meticulous grooming marred by a thin sheen of sweat on his brow, his dark hair slightly askew, as though his fingers had been running through it in agitation. He sat opposite her, his hands clasped tightly between his knees, knuckles white against the tension in his grip. "What is it now, Miss Moreau?" he asked, his voice rushed, brittle. "I've already given my account to the conductor. I wasn't anywhere near the dining car when—" He stopped short, exhaling sharply, his knee bouncing once before he stilled it. "When it happened, I'm not suggesting otherwise," Agatha replied, smoothing her skirt as she settled in. Her voice remained composed, but there was a deliberate edge of curiosity threading through it. "But there are peculiarities I can't quite ignore. For instance, the matter of the drink." Gregory's fingers flexed subtly, the only sign of reaction. She continued, voice quiet but pointed as a needle. "The driver took a cup that had been left unattended. A curious detail, wouldn't you say?" Gregory's eyes narrowed, his breath pulling in just slightly. "What are you getting at?" Agatha tilted her head. "Only that it raises certain questions. Who left the cup there? And why?" Gregory ran a hand through his hair again, the movement quick, jittery. "How should I know? I wasn't there." His words came out faster now, an urgency curling around their edges. "I have no enemies on board. No reason why anyone would." He stopped abruptly, a silence, heavy, thick, then softer. "Why would anyone want me dead?" Agatha's expression didn't change, but her next words landed like a blade. "Why would you assume the poison was meant for you, Mr. Harrington?" He froze, the moment stretched, breathless, electric with unsaid things. Then just as quickly, Gregory barked out a laugh, but it was hollow, the sound of someone grasping for solid ground and finding only air. "You're fishing, Miss Moreau. A fine angler, no doubt, but I'm afraid you're wasting your time." "Perhaps," Agatha murmured. But she didn't blink. Her gaze slid deliberately toward the open case, though she made no move toward it. "And yet I can't help but wonder about the artifact you brought aboard." Gregory's posture locked. "A unique object," she continued, her voice deceptively light. "And as one often hears, unique objects tend to come with unique consequences." Something dark flickered through his expression, an instinct to hide something that had already been seen. "What do you mean by that?" His voice was flat, but his shoulders had drawn just a fraction tighter. Agatha's next words were soft, but sharp enough to pierce. "Margaret Wells seems to believe it isn't rightfully yours." The effect was immediate. Gregory's jaw clenched, and when he spoke, Margaret's name came out like a curse spat between his teeth. "That woman is a liar, bitter and grasping. That artifact is mine. I acquired it fairly. Her claims are nothing but nonsense." Agatha studied him, measured his reaction, the tension coiling around his frame. Then, ever so faintly, she smiled. "Thank you for clarifying that, Mr. Harrington," she said, rising smoothly to her feet, her gloved hands idly smoothing the fabric of her skirt. "I won't trouble you further." Gregory remained seated, but his knuckles had gone pale against the edge of the couch. His breath, though measured, was just a shade too controlled. "You'll find nothing of interest here, Miss Moreau," he murmured. Agatha paused at the door, a gloved hand on the polished brass handle. Then, without turning, she simply said, "We'll see." And with that she stepped out, leaving behind a cabin where the air had grown just a little too heavy, and a man who had just revealed far more than he intended. Agatha Moreau stepped out of cabin 3, her expression composed but her thoughts racing. Gregory Harrington was lying, maybe not in words, but in the stiffness of his jaw, the way his fingers had flexed too sharply at her questions, the barely restrained tremor in his voice. He had secrets, ones he was terrified might come to light, and Agatha intended to find them. As she strode down the corridor, the rhythmic hum of the train beneath her feet, she heard it before she saw it, the strained laughter, the brittle edge of forced mirth. The grand salon was alive with conversation, yet beneath the glittering chandeliers and polished silver, something unspoken simmered. The string quartet played in one corner, their music a noble attempt to restore normalcy, but even they couldn't mask the undercurrent of unease. The storm outside hadn't relented. Every now and then, lightning split the sky, its electric glow flashing through the wide windows, illuminating the faces of the passengers, some pretending to be at ease, others unable to hide their glances toward the door, the shadows, the memory of last night's horror. Near the mahogany bar, Clara Vorel's laughter rang out, too bright, too sharp, the kind of laugh that belonged to someone performing rather than feeling. She was dressed in another of her elegant evening gowns, the emerald necklace around her throat catching the candlelight like a serpent's eye. Beside her, Gregory Harrington lounged, his brandy swirling lazily in his hand, his smirk just a little too self-satisfied. Yet his gaze kept darting to the door, as if waiting, or watching. He didn't have to wait long. The salon doors swung open with a force that made heads turn. Charles Winthrop entered, his composure conspicuously absent. His tie was askew, his usually neat hair disheveled, his breath too controlled to be natural. The air around him seemed to tighten, his movements precise, deliberate, like a man about to confront something dark. His eyes locked onto Clara and Gregory, and he strode toward them with the single-mindedness of a predator closing in. "Clara," he said sharply, cutting through the music like a blade. She turned with an icy slowness, her expression shifting to one of calculated indifference. "Charles," she murmured, her voice sweet but laced with steel. "What a surprise." He ignored her tone. "What do you think you're doing?" A hush rippled through the room. Nearby passengers leaned in, pretending not to listen but catching every word. The musicians faltered, their bows hesitating on the strings. The storm outside growled. Clara arched a delicate brow. "Having a conversation, darling, or is that forbidden in your world?" Gregory chuckled softly, lazily shifting his weight against the bar, his smirk never slipping. "No need to take it so personally, old sport," he drawled, raising his glass. "Clara and I were simply reminiscing." Charles's jaw tightened, his hands curled into fists at his sides. "Nothing more." His voice rose slightly, the control slipping. "Nothing more." "Really, Charles?" Clara sighed, her fingers brushing against Gregory's sleeve, deliberate, taunting. "You do make everything so dreadfully dramatic. You think this is a game." Charles's voice was low now, dangerous. "Tweet." He stepped closer, the tension between the three of them coiling tighter, suffocating. And then, it happened. A sharp crash. A glass shattering against the floor. The sound splintered through the salon like a gunshot. All heads turned. Charles's hand had trembled, just slightly too much. His drink had slipped, brandy seeping across the carpet like something darker. Gregory exhaled a mocking laugh. "Slow and cruel, careful, Winthrop. Losing your grip." But Charles didn't laugh. He didn't even move, because Clara had stepped closer, her smile frozen, her eyes searching his face. And the room, the entire room, was holding its breath. Outside, the storm rumbled on. Inside, something far more dangerous was brewing. Charles took a step closer, his face tight with restrained fury, his breath shallow as if struggling against something deeper than mere jealousy. "I don't claim to own you, Clara," he said, voice low but charged with something raw. "But I do claim the right to ask why you're so willing to." He faltered, his eyes flickering to Gregory's smirk, as if the very word he wanted to use was too vulgar, too dangerous to be spoken aloud. Flirt with someone you barely know. A sharp scrape of wood against marble. Clara stood, the force of her movement, sending her chair skidding slightly back, the sound cutting through the low hum of murmured conversation. For a fleeting second, it seemed as if the entire grand salon held its breath. The chandeliers swayed ever so slightly with the rocking of the train, their golden glow casting shifting shadows on the walls. Clara, now standing taller than both men, lifted her chin, her eyes flashing like sharpened steel. "I will speak to whomever I please, Charles," she said, her voice dangerously smooth. "You seem to think you have some claim over me. You don't, and I won't have you accusing me in front of everyone, no less, of improprieties that exist only in your mind." Gregory chuckled softly, tipping his glass slightly as if toasting the rising tension. The brandy sloshed just shy of the rim. Now, he mused, his smirk deepening. "Let's not turn this into a, 'You stay out of this,'" Charles snapped, his voice losing the careful restraint he had so desperately clung to. His fist was clenched at his side now, knuckles white, and for a moment, a single unbearable moment, it seemed as if he might strike Gregory. Clara moved instantly, stepping between them, her silhouette outlined in the flickering candle light. "Stop it," she commanded, her tone low, firm, dangerous. "Both of you, this childish posturing is ridiculous." She exhaled sharply, her gaze cold as ice. "Honestly, you're embarrassing yourselves." At the far end of the room, Agatha Moreau sat silently, a small leather-bound notebook resting in her lap. She had positioned herself deliberately, far enough to avoid notice, yet with a clear vantage point of the entire confrontation. Her pencil moved steadily, recording not just words, but shifts in posture, flickers of hesitation, the unspoken tension weaving through every exchanged glance. Charles's hands were shaking, but whether from anger or something more sinister, she couldn't yet say. Gregory's amusement was too polished, too staged. And Clara had calculated every syllable, every pause, as if she knew exactly how to play. This wasn't just a lover's quarrel, this was something older, deeper, something that had festered long before tonight. Outside, the storm lashed against the windows, its distant growl a haunting echo to the atmosphere within. Elsewhere on the train, in the muted solitude of the observation car, a different kind of storm was brewing. The lamps here were dim, the large windows streaked with rain. Margaret Wells sat stiffly, her usual table by the far end feeling colder than ever. Her tea sat untouched before her, the delicate porcelain trembling slightly in her hands. She wasn't looking at the cup, her gaze was fixed outside, on the blurred landscape rushing past. But it was clear, she wasn't really seeing it. Agatha entered quietly, her footfalls absorbed by the thick carpet. She did not speak at once. Instead she paused by the opposite window, mirroring Margaret's stance. For a moment they simply existed in the same space, two figures shrouded in their own private thoughts. Then, without turning, Agatha spoke. "Such a gloomy day," she murmured, her tone light but precise. "Rather fitting, don't you think?" Margaret stiffened, her grip on the teacup tightened, just slightly, but she didn't look away from the window. "If you've come to interrogate me, Miss Moreau," she said finally, her voice a brittle attempt at composure, "I'll save you the trouble, I have nothing to say." Agatha smiled faintly, and moved to sit across from her, hands folding neatly in her lap. She did not press. She had learned long ago that silence was often the most effective interrogation tool. And sure enough, after a beat of heavy pause, Margaret broke first. "I confronted him." The words came suddenly, the sharpness in them cutting through the dim air. "I admit it. I told Gregory exactly what I thought of him." Agatha tilted her head ever so slightly, her eyes keen. "And what was that?" Margaret finally turned her gaze away from the window, but not to meet Agatha's. Instead she stared at her untouched tea. her hands trembling just enough to be noticeable. "He's a liar, Miss Moreau." The bitterness in her voice was palpable. "The artifact he carries so smugly, the one he flaunts as if it belongs to him, it isn't his by right." Agatha's breath was steady, but her pulse quickened. An artifact, a claim, a betrayal. Pieces were shifting. Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. "It's part of my family's past," she swallowed. "And if he truly understood what it meant, he wouldn't be so eager to hold on to it." The wind howled outside. Inside, Agatha slowly, methodically, set down her notebook. The game was changing. The dimly lit carriage rocked gently as the train cut through the storm-lashed countryside, the rhythmic clatter of wheels against the tracks, a steady, foreboding pulse in the tense atmosphere. Rain lashed against the windows, streaking the glass with silver trails as flashes of lightning illuminated the darkened sky. Inside, the air was thick with unspoken words, the kind that linger just before something shatters beyond repair. Eleanor Blackwood, a woman of quiet calculation, sat motionless near the window, her gloved fingers resting lightly against the table's polished surface. She seemed composed, almost detached, but behind her sharp, unwavering gaze, her mind worked like a well-oiled machine, assembling pieces of a puzzle that no one else realized existed yet. Her eyes flicked across the carriage, noting everything. The way Victor Sterling, draped in his usual air of arrogant nonchalance, lounged at the center of it all, a smirk curling at the edges of his mouth. He was the kind of man who took what he pleased, a collector of both riches and misfortune, and tonight, that arrogance hung around him like a cloak. Across from him sat Henry Caldwell, his usually composed demeanor cracking, his posture rigid, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the armrests of his chair. There was something simmering beneath his restrained fury, something that spoke of betrayal, of old wounds reopened. "You've stolen what was never yours to claim." Henry's voice was low, each syllable clipped with barely contained rage. He didn't raise his voice, but the way he leaned forward, his entire frame taut with controlled aggression, made it clear that he was moments away from losing that restraint. Victor merely chuckled, an infuriatingly calm sound that sent a ripple through the already tense air. He lifted his glass lazily, swirling the amber liquid inside, the ice clinking softly. "Oh, come now, Henry," he drawled, his tone almost amused. "Business is business. If you couldn't hold on to your family's little prize, that's hardly my concern." The words hung between them, sharp as a blade, but it wasn't just Henry who bristled at them. Across the carriage, a few passengers exchanged wary glances, some subtly leaning in, pretending to be engrossed in their own conversations while their ears remained keenly attuned to the unfolding drama. A waiter, who had been moving between the tables with practiced ease, hesitated just slightly as he placed a drink in front of a guest, his fingers trembling faintly before he quickly withdrew. Eleanor inhaled slowly, measuring the scene, every glance and twitch of the hand, every lingering pause between words. These were not just passing emotions, these were motives forming right before her eyes, motives laced with resentment and long-held grudges. She had seen this kind of tension before, the kind that inevitably unraveled into something irreversible. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, Victor raised his glass to his lips, a triumphant glint in his eyes. But before he could take a sip, the moment shattered. A strangled cough erupted from a table nearby. The room turned in unison. Edward Thorne, an unassuming clerk who had barely spoken a word all evening, clutched his throat, his face contorted in agony. His fingers scrabbled at the collar of his shirt as a garbled, choked gasp escaped his lips. The wine glass before him trembled, teetered, then tipped, spilling deep crimson across the white linen, a stain spreading like a slow-moving omen. A sharp gasp cut through the air. Chairs scraped back violently as passengers lurched away horrified. A woman near the bar clutched her companion's arm, her knuckles turning white. Someone knocked over a tray of drinks, the sound of shattering glass almost lost beneath the rising tide of alarmed voices. Eleanor did not move. Her gaze remained fixed, not on Edward, but on the expressions of those around him. The way Victor's smirk had vanished, his eyes narrowing, lips slightly parted in something between confusion and dawning realization. The way Henry's grip on the armrests had loosened, his shoulders stiff, as though he had just witnessed something he had not accounted for. This was no accident, and it wasn't meant for Edward. Somewhere in this carriage, hidden beneath polite expressions and quiet gasps, lay the true hand of a murderer. Someone who had carefully planned their move, someone who had every intention of watching their chosen target crumble. But fate, or miscalculation, had intervened. The storm outside raged on, but inside, an even deadlier storm was brewing. Eleanor knew one thing with certainty: the game had just begun, and she was already 10 steps ahead. The storm had passed, but the tension it left in its wake clung to the grand dining carriage like a thick fog. The passengers had resumed their places, some nervously stirring their tea, others casting sidelong glances at the empty chair where the unfortunate victim had last sat. The chandeliers overhead glowed with a deceptive warmth, their golden light flickering against the polished mahogany panels, but no amount of luxury could mask the unease that had settled over the room. At the far end of the carriage, Evelyn Mercer sat upright, her gloved fingers laced together as she surveyed the faces around her with quiet scrutiny. The whispers of speculation had not died down, nor had the sense of foreboding that hung in the air like the echo of a scream yet to be heard. The poisoned drink had not been intended for Edward Langley, the unsuspecting businessman who now lay lifeless in the next compartment, his final breath stolen by a miscalculated twist of fate. No, the true target still lived, breathing, unaware, or perhaps very much aware, of the attempt on their life. Her gaze landed on Lawrence Devereux, his well-tailored suit unwrinkled, despite the chaos, his hand idly tracing the rim of his glass, a calculated nonchalance that only someone deeply accustomed to deception could maintain. He had always been a collector of both objects and people, a man who found amusement in the desperation of others. Across from him sat Victor Blackwell, his posture stiff, his fingers drumming an uneven rhythm against the tablecloth. There was a tightness around his mouth, the kind that came not from grief, but from something far more dangerous: fear. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, catching the flicker of movement at the edge of her vision. Clara Whitmore, the ever-enigmatic socialite, leaned forward just enough for the light to catch the diamond at her throat, her lips parting as though she were about to speak, but she hesitated. A woman who never hesitated, that was telling in itself. "The real question," Evelyn finally said, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a knife through silk, "is why." A hush fell over the table. Victor exhaled sharply. "Why?" he repeated, his voice edged with something dangerously close to laughter. "Why does it matter? The man's dead. Isn't that tragedy enough?" Evelyn's fingers tapped once, deliberately, against the armrest of her chair. Tragedy, yes. Accident, no. That cup was not meant for Langley. He was merely an unfortunate variable in someone else's equation. The question is, who among us was meant to drink that poison? A ripple of discomfort passed through the group. Even Lawrence's ever-present smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. Evelyn saw it. She noted it. She continued, her voice calm, deliberate. Someone planned this. Someone had a very specific target in mind. And the only reason we are still gathered here, rather than watching a different body being carried from this train, is because of chance. A simple, unpredictable moment of chance. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Clara's gaze flickered toward Lawrence, then quickly away. Victor shifted in his seat, his fingers tightening around the stem of his untouched wine glass. Evelyn allowed the tension to settle, let it seep into their skin. Then she leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. And chance is a very unreliable accomplice to murder. Lightning flickered beyond the rain-streaked windows, illuminating the expressions of the assembled guests. Guilt, fear, calculation. Someone in this room had planned a murder, someone had failed, and someone Evelyn knew would not fail twice. The low hum of the train against the tracks was the only sound breaking the thick silence of the grand salon. The storm had passed, but the echoes of what had transpired remained, clinging to the air like an unspoken truth. The passengers sat in a tense semicircle, their faces illuminated by the dim golden glow of the chandeliers overhead. At the center of it all stood Evelyn Mercer, her posture composed, her expression unreadable, yet her presence was undeniable. Across from her, Lawrence Devereux leaned back in his chair, his usual smirk now a pale shadow of itself, while Victor Blackwell fidgeted with the cuff of his sleeve, his movements betraying the nervous energy simmering beneath his carefully maintained exterior. And then there was Isabella Harrow, ever poised, her lips curved into a faint, knowing smile that never quite reached her eyes. "You would never, wouldn't you?" Evelyn mused, her voice smooth but unwavering. You watched as Mr. Blackwell charmed his way into Miss Harrow's confidence, basked in her attentions while you seethed in the shadows. You let resentment grow, let it fester, until it consumed you entirely. And so you acted. You thought that by removing him, you would finally have her all to yourself. Lawrence scoffed, but the sound lacked conviction. His hands curled around the arms of his chair, knuckles white. It wasn't supposed to. Really, such dramatics, Isabella interrupted, her voice like silk laced with steel. The room turned toward her, but she remained composed, the hint of amusement in her eyes never faltering. Evelyn shifted her gaze toward her. And you, Miss Harrow, while Mr. Devereux's motives were fueled by passion, yours were of a far colder nature. From the beginning your interest in Mr. Blackwell was never about him, it was about what he possessed. The questions you asked, the carefully placed smiles, the subtle manipulations, they were not the actions of a woman in love, but of someone seeking to secure something of great value. The flicker of a smile touched Isabella's lips. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Miss Mercer." "Oh, but I think you do," Evelyn countered smoothly. "You played your part brilliantly, stringing Mr. Blackwell along while simultaneously stoking Mr. Devereux's jealousy, even distracting Miss Aldridge when it suited you. But in the end, your plan depended on Mr. Blackwell staying alive. You would never have sanctioned something as extreme as poisoning him. That was someone else's doing." The sharp inhalation from across the room drew Evelyn's attention back to Victor. His jaw was clenched, his fingers tightening around the delicate stem of his untouched wineglass. His entire body radiated barely concealed agitation. "This is preposterous," he finally burst out, his voice taut with barely restrained anger. "I've done nothing wrong. All I did was claim what was rightfully mine. The rest is nonsense." Evelyn's gaze remained steady. "You may believe that, Mr. Blackwell, but your arrogance, your carelessness, set this entire chain of events into motion. Miss Aldridge has claimed that the artifact in your possession belongs to her family, but you dismissed her concerns. You flaunted it, as if it were nothing more than a trinket, heedless of the consequences. While you did not put the poison in that cup, your actions created the conditions that made it possible." Victor's face darkened, but he said nothing more. Instead he sank back into his chair, his expression unreadable. Across from him, Lawrence sat motionless, his head bowed, his breath coming in shallow, uneven bursts. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. It was never supposed to be him. "I didn't mean to." He exhaled sharply, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. I couldn't let him take her." Silence fell over the room, heavy and suffocating. Evelyn let it linger, let the weight of his words settle over them like a final verdict. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer, yet no less resolute. "I believe you, Mr. Devereux. I believe you never intended to harm the driver. But the fact remains that your actions led to his death, and now we must face the consequences." Lawrence nodded weakly, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his own confession. The train began to slow as it approached the station, the distant whistle slicing through the morning mist like a final call to reckoning. Passengers pressed against the windows, eager to glimpse the platform ahead. Among them, Lawrence sat pale and silent, flanked by a pair of somber railway officials. His hands were bound, though the restraint seemed unnecessary. The fight had long since left him. As the wheels ground against the tracks, Evelyn remained seated, watching, waiting. The storm outside had passed, but inside, within the hearts of those left behind, the storm of human folly and fatal ambition had left its mark, one that would never truly fade. The train eased to a halt with a shuddering sigh, steam curling along the platform like ghostly fingers reaching for the past. The uniformed authorities boarded swiftly, their movements efficient, devoid of sympathy or ceremony. With a bowed head and lifeless eyes, Lawrence Devereux stepped off the train, his hands bound yet limp, his fight long since extinguished. The air around him was thick with the murmurs of passengers who had witnessed his fall from grace, their hushed voices blending with the distant hiss of the locomotive. In the grand salon, the remnants of the storm lingered in the faces of those left behind. Isabella Harrow stood rigid, her emerald necklace, a symbol of vanity and power, now dulled against her pale skin, as though the night's revelations had drained it of its brilliance. Across from her, Victor Blackwell remained by the window, his reflection warped in the glass, a once proud figure now reduced to an uneasy shadow. His fingers, always so deft in negotiation, now twitched imperceptibly at his sides, betraying the nerves he fought to conceal. Further down the car, Margaret Aldridge methodically collected her belongings, each movement precise, deliberate. Her aged hands, so often steady in battle, now trembled ever so slightly as they brushed against the locked compartment that held the artifact, an object that had brought nothing but ruin. Neither she nor Blackwell could claim it now, not without dragging each other through a legal hellstorm, a fact they both acknowledged in a single passing glance, eyes meeting briefly before turning away. The whisper of dresses against polished floors, the shuffle of hesitant footsteps, the creak of the train settling into stillness, all spoke of an aftermath heavier than words could capture. And then Evelyn Mercer moved. Unassuming in her simple coat and sensible heels, she walked through the hushed carriage, her ever-present notebook resting lightly in her gloved fingers. There was no triumph in her eyes, only the quiet understanding of someone who had unraveled yet another tale of greed, jealousy and folly. The conductor, his face weary yet relieved, stepped forward as she reached the exit. "Miss Mercer," he said, his cap held to his chest. "I don't know what we would have done without you." She gave him the faintest of smiles, the kind that held neither arrogance nor false modesty, only truth. "You give me too much credit," she replied. "The answers were always there, I simply saw them." He opened his mouth as if to insist otherwise, but she had already turned, stepping onto the platform where the world bustled around her, unaware of the storm that had raged within the confines of the train. Porters called out names, steam billowed in the cold morning air, and vendors hawked newspapers filled with yesterday's news. Evelyn Mercer did not linger. She was swallowed by the tide of travelers, her slight frame vanishing into the swirl of movement, her steps unhurried, her purpose unchanged. The case of the Midnight Express would become just another footnote in the long list of stories she carried with her. But to Evelyn, it was yet another reminder, no matter how cleverly concealed, the truth always found its way to the light.